Hey there. Tonight we're not stepping into a history book. We're stepping into it by accident. You've time traveled to medieval England. No warning, no guidebook, just the cold, the mud, and the strange stares of people who know you don't belong. This isn't the world of knights and legends. This is the world of chamber pots, spoiled bread, and social rules that could get you fogged if you bow wrong. You'll fumble through languages, lose your bag, and pretend to know saints you've never heard of, all just to survive another day. If quiet, immersive history helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it brings you some peace. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always oddly comforting to see how far these stories travel. So, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan, and settle in. Let's begin with you waking up in the wrong century. You wake up to silence. Not the digital kind, not the hum of appliances or the faint buzz of a city outside your window, but real, pressing, unnerving silence. The kind of silence that belongs to a place without electricity, without traffic, without time. A heavy, unyielding quiet broken only by the distant rustle of leaves and the hollow hoot of a nightbird. Your hands are cold, the air is damp, you're lying in dirt. You sit up slowly, heart hammering, but a strange mix of confusion and dread. It's dark. Not night in the city, dark, but pitch. Total absence of light. Your eyes strain. Eventually shapes begin to form. Trees, moss, maybe a distant flicker of firelight between crooked branches. You reach for your phone. No service, no signal, just 3% battery, and a lock screen that suddenly feels like the last connection to your own world. You try to breathe, then you notice the smell. Earthy, smoky, not exactly unpleasant, just unfamiliar. The air carries wood smoke, wet leaves, manure, and something musky you can't quite place. It's the smell of a world that hasn't been sanitized. Congratulations! You're not in Kansas anymore. You're in the English countryside, and, judging by the absence of stone roads, fences, or chimneys, you're several hundred years too early. You're in medieval England, probably the 14th century. You don't know how you got here. The time machine joke is long past funny. Now you need a plan. First rule, don't panic. Second rule, don't let anyone see you arrive. In the medieval world, people weren't necessarily terrified of strangers, but they were very interested in them. And if your clothing, speech, or behavior marks you as too foreign, too different, you won't get burned as a witch probably, but you will be talked about, questioned, and possibly robbed or worse, forced into some story you can't control. So you move quietly. The forest around you is thick, but not untouched. These aren't wild woods. They've been cut, scavenged, managed. Medieval England's forests weren't untouched nature preserves. They were heavily used for firewood, for hunting by nobles, for gathering mushrooms and berries by peasants if allowed. But most forest land was owned. Every twig had a price. If you're caught breaking branches or dragging wood and you can't prove you're a tenant of the local lord, it could be considered theft. And in this era, theft could get your hand chopped off. You walk toward the glow of a town still hidden among the trees. The lights are few, a smattering of torches, or maybe hearth fires showing through crude wooden shutters. There are no street lamps, no windows of glass, just wooden planks with slits, or animal hide stretched thin. Light leaks, flickers, then vanishes. As you get closer, you find the road. It's not paved, not even cobbled, just packed mud, scored by cart ruts and pocked with puddles. Medieval roads weren't designed for comfort. They were functional scars across the land, often flooded, slippery, and worse after a freeze. You try to keep your footing, but already your shoes, sleek, modern, unmistakable, are coated in grime. You take them off, hide them. Your socks go too. Clothing matters. You're wearing materials they've never seen. Synthetic fibers, zippers, stitching machines hadn't been invented. If you walk into town in jeans and a sweatshirt, you're an alien, no matter how friendly you try to be. Best case scenario, they think you're from a faraway land. Worst case, they think you're an escaped lunatic. So you do what any prudent time traveler would. Bury your clothes in the woods, tuck your phone deep into your bag, tie your hoodie around a tree, strip down to a thermal undershirt that almost passes for a linen tunic. You pull your hair into something vaguely rustic. You rub a little dirt on your face and practice looking underfed. There's a town gate ahead. You approach it just before dawn. Towns in this period often had gates not to keep people in, but to keep animals and thieves out. Many had curfews, often marked by the ringing of a bell at sundown. After dark, entry was restricted unless you had a very good reason. If you'd arrived earlier, you might have been turned away or even fined. But now, as first light creeps in, soft blue and pink across the frost-touched earth, the town begins to stir. You enter with a small group of people. Traders, peasants, maybe pilgrims. No one notices you. The street is narrow, muddy. Houses lean at odd angles. They're timber-framed WL and daub, meaning wooden slats packed with mud and straw. The roofs are thatched. The air smells like firewood and animal waste. Chickens dart across the path. You almost step on one. People here sleep differently. Most take a first sleep, wake in the middle of the night for a couple of hours to stoke the fire, say prayers or talk quietly, and then return to a second sleep. The idea of a single 8-hour sleep wasn't common. That's modern and rare. You pass what must be a blacksmith's forge, soot-blackened walls, the smell of iron and sweat, a stable, a cook shop, selling yesterday's bread, and something bubbling in a pot that smells like onions and despair. No one greets you, that's good. But they will ask eventually, Moai, who are you? In the Middle Ages, everyone belonged to someone, to a household, a guild, a parish, a trade. There's no such thing as a just passing through traveller. If you don't belong to a network, you're not protected. And if you're not protected, you're vulnerable to crime, arrest, or simple suspicion. So you rehearse your answer. You're a pilgrim. That's the safest option. Pilgrims were common and they could be from anywhere. A story about being on the road to Canterbury or Santiago de Compostela will satisfy most people. You invent a village 400 miles away, hoping no one here has relatives there. You bow politely when someone makes eye contact. Don't shake hands. That wasn't common yet. You speak as little as possible. Your accent is strange, your grammar worse. You mumble. You smile faintly, and then someone offers you bread. It's dry, dense, mostly rye, probably bulked with barley and bean flour, but it's warm. You chew it slowly, nodding thanks, hoping the act of eating makes you look less like someone who fell from the sky last night. And just like that, you've survived your first hour, but the day hasn't even begun. You've been awake for less than an hour, and already you're someone else. That's how things work here. No passports, no IDs, no background checks, just stories. And in medieval England, your story is your protection. You need one fast. You choose the safest lie you can think of. You're a pilgrim. You tell your first version of it to a stable boy. He asks where you're headed. You pause. Canterbury, you say. Not because you're religious, but because it's the only medieval pilgrimage destination you can name under pressure. It works. He nods solemnly and goes back to mucking out straw. That's your new truth now. You're a pilgrim on your way to visit the shrine of St. Thomas Becket, the Archbishop famously murdered in Canterbury Cathedral in 1170. His martyrdom turned the city into one of Europe's most visited holy sites. Pilgrims came from all over, rich and poor, sick and healthy, devout and desperate, hoping for miracles, forgiveness, or just a few days of rest under God's gaze. It's a good cover. Pilgrims were everywhere in the Middle Ages, moving between towns, staying at inns and monasteries, travelling in groups when they could, alone when they had to. Some wore the scallop shell of Santiago, others carried wooden staffs or painted tokens from previous shrines. Most were poor, many were ill, a few were fugitives, all were tired, and now you are one of them. The lie isn't just for strangers, it's for yourself too. You repeat it internally, smoothing the edges. You come from a distant village, you're travelling alone because your cousin fell ill. You're visiting Canterbury because your brother had a dream. You're doing penance for a sin you won't name. You've practiced just enough church Latin to make your mumbled prayers sound authentic. Your story buys you shelter. A grey-robed monk at a small priory hears your tale and waves you inside. He doesn't ask many questions. He doesn't seem surprised by your strange accent or your patchy knowledge of scripture. Pilgrims were expected to be odd. You say you've been walking for weeks. He believes you. Everyone looks weathered here. He shows you to a room. Not really a room. More like a corner of a draughty hall with 3 other pilgrims sleeping side by side. One of them snores like an injured bear. Another mutters in his sleep. You pull your borrowed wool cloak tighter around your shoulders and try not to think about the bed bugs. Hospices and monasteries were some of the few places in medieval Europe where travellers could sleep without paying coin. The church was legally and spiritually obligated to provide charity to pilgrims. That obligation was sometimes ignored, of course, especially if the monk in question was having a bad day or the prize was stretched thin, but most would still offer at least some stale bread, a spoonful of pottage, and a patch of floor near a fire. You eat what you're given. Barley pottage boiled grey and salted with tears. You chew slowly, trying not to think of seasoning. Spices exist in this time, but not for you. A pinch of pepper costs more than your borrowed cloak. Your spoon is shared, wiped on cloth that has seen better centuries. Your bowl is wood, splintered, and probably older than the Magna Carta. Around you, the other pilgrims talk. One limps from a foot wound. Another coughs so violently you're surprised he's still upright. They tell their stories. A woman hoping for her son's healing, a man seeking redemption for adultery, a third who just wanted to see the world while his debts cooled down back home. None of them ask why you're here. They understand. In the Middle Ages, pilgrimage was part religion, part social mobility, and part escape. It was a way to disappear without actually vanishing. You try to sleep, but your thoughts churn. In your world, identity is static. Name, photo, ID, biometrics. Here, it's malleable. You could be anyone so long as you can walk in a straight line and keep your story straight. No one here has heard of Google. No one's going to fact-check your claim that your uncle once met a monk in Morset Michel. They'll just nod. People believe strangers because they have to. The entire medieval world runs on trust and fear. The next morning you rise early, not by choice. There's no privacy, no doors, and the bell tolls for matins well before dawn. The monastery is cold. Your breath fogs in the dark. You don't know the prayers, but you stand with the others, murmuring nonsense syllables under your breath. No one notices. Half of them are doing the same. Afterward, you're handed a heel of bread and told to move along. Pilgrims don't linger. Outside, the town is stirring. Vendors are rolling open stalls, mostly selling vegetables, old tools, or grey-looking meat. You walk past a butcher store and try not to stare too long at the headless pig carcass hanging from an iron hook. Flies already dance around it. Meat went bad quickly here. Salt was expensive. Freshness was a fantasy. You remember something from a history video? Most medieval towns had a market day, usually once a week. That's when rural folk from nearby villages brought their goods in to sell eggs, cheese, root vegetables. You'd have to barter or haggle. And there's no such thing as fixed prices. Everything is a negotiation. And if you don't know the local currency, silver pennies, half pennies, fairings, you'll get fleeced. You want to buy something, but realize you have nothing to trade, not even a coin. You still have your wristwatch tucked into a wool sleeve. You glance at it, but it means nothing here. No one cares what time it is. People in this world measure time by bells, prayers, and the position of the sun. If it's light out, you work. If it's dark, you pray, hide, or sleep. You decide to ask for help instead. You spot a woman selling oatcakes and approach slowly, trying to look humble but not pitiful. You speak softly, explaining you're on the road, low on supplies, and blessed to meet such a generous face. It's not Shakespeare, but she gives you one cake anyway. Maybe she believes you. Maybe she just likes feeding people. Maybe she wants your blessing. Pilgrims were holy, or at least adjacent to holiness. Many townsfolk believe that aiding a pilgrim earned favor with God. You say a quick Deus to Benedica in your best fake Latin accent. It means God bless you. She nods, pleased. You chew slowly as you wander the streets. The oatcake is dense, unsweetened, and laced with something bitter. Wormwood maybe, or just bad grain. Still, it's food. You count your blessings. 1 oatcake, 2 working legs, no fever yet. You pass a group of children playing in the dirt. One of them is holding a carved wooden hoop, rolling it along the ground with a stick. Another clutch is a crude doll made of rags. They stop and stare at you, not in fear, just curiosity. One points to your wrist. You cover it instinctively. That's when it hits you. You're not out of the woods. You've got your story, your cloak, your pilgrim status, but you don't have years of dirt under your fingernails. You don't carry yourself like someone who's been beaten down by a lifetime of scarcity. You walk too straight. You flinch at smells. You make eye contact too much. It's subtle, but it's there. To them, you still don't quite belong. So you drop your gaze. You shuffle a little more. You mimic the limp of the man you saw last night. You avoid direct questions. You learn to listen before you speak. This world doesn't care how smart you are. It cares whether you follow the rhythm, blend in, or vanish. That night, you find another place to sleep. A barn offered by a generous farmer in exchange for chopping wood. You say yes before he finishes the sentence. Your hands blister after 5 minutes. He doesn't notice or doesn't care. Labor is labor. Pain is normal. As you lie in the hay, curled into a ball against the cold, you rehearse your story again. You're a pilgrim from the north on the road to Canterbury, travelling for penance, alone, always alone. And as the stars turn overhead, bright and indifferent, you realize this truth. Lying is easy in the Middle Ages. Living is not. You wake to birdsong and a stiff neck. The straw you slept on has shifted in the night. and now a twig has embedded itself somewhere beneath your shoulder blade. You roll over slowly, swatting at gnats, and blink your eyes open to a patch of grey sky and the low, heavy branches of oak. There's no roof here, just tree limbs and fog. This is your camp now. No walls, no hearth, just a hollow in the earth behind a mossy boulder hidden off the forest path. The best place for someone like you to disappear for a while. You are lucky to be offered work. Not everyone is the farmer's sister, or perhaps his wife, you couldn't tell, told you there was a need for extra hands gathering firewood and herbs from the forest. You agreed before asking what it entailed. You needed the food. You still do, so now, for today, you are a forager. And like everything else in the Middle Ages, this job comes with rules. First rule, the forest does not belong to you. That might be hard to accept, especially if you come from a world where trees are public, land is protected, and anyone with a pair of hiking boots can wander freely. But here in the 1300s, the forest is not wilderness, it is property. Every stretch of woodland in England is either held by a noble, claimed by the crown, or attached to an estate. You do not own the acorns. You do not own the rabbits. You do not own the fallen twigs. Collecting firewood might seem harmless, but if you're caught with the wrong bundle of sticks in the wrong part of the woods, you could be beaten, fined, or even branded. This is the age of the forest laws introduced after the Norman conquest and expanded under monarchs like Henry II. These laws protected hunting grounds for the elite. Royal forests were especially off-limits, even to peasants who lived nearby. You could be hanged for killing a deer, mutilated for setting traps, or flogged for chopping down trees. So, second rule, don't get caught. You keep to the edges, avoiding cleared paths. You carry a dull knife and a sack that once held barley. You pick up only what's already fallen, twigs, small branches, dry bramble. No cutting, no chopping, just gathering. The forest is quiet in the early hours, save for the rustle of squirrels and the distant call of a wood pigeon. You see no other humans. Good, that's what you want. The best foragers are the ones no one notices. But silence doesn't mean safety. The forest is still dangerous. Wolves are gone, mostly hunted out of southern England by this century. Bears have been extinct here for hundreds of years, but there are still dangers. Wild boars, hornets, and most of all men. You hear a crunch behind you. You freeze. Just a deer, probably. Still your heart hammers. Bandits are real here. The woods are a natural hideout for the desperate. Escaped serfs, outlaws, deserters from local militias, they live rough, ambush travelers and disappear into the trees. The king's law doesn't stretch far into these parts. If someone robs you out here, you won't get justice. You won't get anything. So you keep your head down and work faster. You don't just gather firewood. You're also collecting wild herbs. The farmer's sister, no, his wife, you've decided, gave you a list scrolled with marks you can't read, but she named them aloud: yarrow, mug, wart, chickweed, comfrey, plantain. You recognize some, you pretend to recognize the rest. These plants are not just for flavoring food, though food could certainly use the help. They're medicine, insect repellent, even magic in the eyes of some. You pick them carefully and place them in separate cloth pouches. You whisper their names under your breath, part prayer, part memory. A patch of nettles stings your hands. You doubles, but say nothing, no gloves. You'll just deal with it. You take a break at midday, crouched near a tree stump. Your lunch is a crust of rye bread, hard as stone, and a pinch of salt from the bottom of your pocket. You eat it slowly like it matters. There's water nearby, a stream shallow and slick, with green algae. You scoop some into your hands and drink. The taste is earthy. But when those ideals threatened her power, she suppressed them. She dreamed of freeing the serfs, but expanded serfdom. She spoke of equality, but ruled with absolute authority. And yet her impact is undeniable. She modernized Russia's administration, making it more efficient, more centralized, more capable. She brought schools, hospitals, and the arts to cities that had once known little more than military parades and church rituals. Under her leadership, Russia became not just bigger, but stronger, wealthier, and more respected on the world stage. She ruled in a man's world and beat men at their own game. Her court was filled with powerful advisors and lovers. But make no mistake, Catherine was always the one in control. Every relationship, every policy, every letter she wrote was part of a broader vision. She turned St. Petersburg into a beacon of European culture. She expanded the empire's borders beyond imagination, and she left behind libraries, statues, and institutions that carried her name long after her death. But perhaps her greatest legacy is not in territory or legislation, but in possibility. Catherine proved that a woman could lead an empire that charisma, intellect, and sheer force of will could elevate a minor princess into a world-shaping sovereign. She shattered expectations, not with rebellion, but with refinement, not with noise, but with calculation. To some, she remains a symbol of tyranny, to others, the goddess of reason. But to history, she is something greater than myth, something real, a flawed, brilliant, relentless human being who ruled for over 3 decades and left her fingerprints on an entire civilization. Catherine the Great didn't just reign, she rewrote the script for what a ruler any ruler could be. Long before it was a city, El Dorado was a man, a king, they said, covered from head to toe in fine gold dust. He stood upon a raft floating in the middle of a sacred lake, surrounded by priests and nobles. As the sun rose, he cast jewels, emeralds, and golden offerings into the water, tributes to the gods. It was a ceremony, a legend, a whisper in the wind. The indigenous Muisca people of what is now Colombia called him El Hombre Dorado, the Golden Man. But when the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the early 1500s, they misunderstood. They heard El Dorado and didn't think of a ritual or a man. They imagined a place, a golden kingdom hidden in the mountains, untouched by war, glittering with treasure. The transformation was quick. In the European imagination, El Dorado morphed from a man into a city, then a kingdom, then an entire empire. The name didn't just mean gold, it meant paradise, salvation, a place where all desires could be fulfilled. And for the Spaniards, starving, desperate, thousands of miles from home, it was irresistible. The jungles of South America became alive with the rumor. Somewhere deep in the green unknown, a city of gold waited. The native people spoke carefully, often trying to appease or mislead their aggressive guests. They mentioned far-off lands, strange rivers, and shimmering objects. The conquistadors, hungry for wealth and honor, took every word as a clue. El Dorado wasn't just a myth, it became a fever. In campfires and letters back home, the tale grew larger. Soldiers who hadn't even left Spain heard about it. Poets romanticized it. Monarchs funded expeditions for it. It no longer mattered if it existed. What mattered was the belief that it could. And belief in the age of conquest was all you needed. This golden illusion would drive some men to greatness and others to madness. It would become one of the most powerful legends in the history of exploration, a promise of riches just out of reach, always deeper in the jungle, always just beyond the next ridge. El Dorado was no longer a story. It was a compass that pointed to nowhere. And still they followed it. In 1541, a brutal expedition set out from Quito, led by Gonzalo Pizarro, brother of the infamous Francisco Pizarro, who had conquered the Inca Empire. Gonzalo had heard the rumors of cinnamon forests, of lands rich with gold, and of a golden city called El Dorado waiting just beyond the Andes. He was determined to find it, no matter the cost. He brought with him over 300 Spanish soldiers, hundreds of native porters, a few dozen horses, and a dream made of gold and desperation. The jungle, however, was not a dream. It was a living, breathing nightmare. Rain poured for days without stopping. Rivers swelled and swallowed their supplies. Insects devoured skin. Men collapsed from exhaustion, hunger, and disease. As the weeks dragged into months, the expedition began to disintegrate. Food vanished. Morale crumbled. Many of the indigenous porters died or fled. The Spanish, wearing heavy armor and carrying weapons now useless against the jungle, became weak. That group was led by Francisco de Orellana, a lesser-known nobleman who would soon make history by accident. Orellana's party floated down a river, following its winding current deeper into unknown territory. Days turned into weeks, and Orellana realized he couldn't return upstream to rejoin Pizarro. There was only one path left forward. With a handful of men and a makeshift brigantine, Orellana continued down what would one day be called the Amazon River. He passed through vast, seemingly endless forests and encountered indigenous civilizations that appeared far more advanced than expected. He later claimed to have seen grand cities, well-organized societies, and even tribes of warrior women, stories that would inflame the El Dorado legend for centuries. Eventually, Orellana reached the Atlantic Ocean. He became the first European to navigate the entire length of the Amazon, but he had found no gold, no El Dorado, only a myth that now stretched across a continent. Back in the Andes, Gonzalo Pizarro's forces had nearly all died. The survivors crawled back to Quito, broken and starving, but the damage had already been done. The jungle had taken its first real blood for El Dorado, and the myth was just getting started. By the mid-1500s, the Spanish obsession with El Dorado had shifted from the vast unknown of the jungle to a single haunting place, Lake Guatavita. Nestled in the green highlands of what is now central Colombia, this almost perfectly circular crater lake shimmered with eerie beauty. But it wasn't the view that drew conquistadors, it was the legend. The Moisa people who lived nearby had long performed sacred rituals there. One ritual in particular had gripped European imaginations. A chieftain, naked and dusted in gold, sailing to the center of the lake on a raft, tossing emeralds, gold, and precious offerings into the water as gifts to the gods. To the Spanish, it wasn't religion, it was a vault, and they were determined to open it. In 1536, Conquistador Gonzalo Jiménez de Sada was the first to arrive. His men fished a few golden trinkets from the lake's edge, stirring just enough hope to keep the obsession alive. Over the next few decades, multiple attempts were made to extract the supposed treasure resting at the lake's bottom. In one of the most infamous efforts, in 1580, a wealthy entrepreneur named Antonio de Sepulveda tried to drain the entire lake. He and his crew of indigenous laborers dug a massive gash into the mountainside, forming a channel to bleed the water away. As the level dropped, mud and debris surfaced along with some pieces of gold, but the sides collapsed before the lake could be fully drained. The excavation killed many workers, and while a few golden artifacts were found, the mythical hoard of treasure remained hidden beneath layers of silt and legend. Still, the effort had a strange consequence. The lake itself became sacred to the myth of El Dorado. It wasn't just a backdrop anymore. It became the beating heart of the story. A place where gold had been offered for centuries, where secrets lay buried beneath the water's surface, and where hope refused to die. Even centuries later, Lake Guatvita would draw treasure hunters armed with sonar, scuba gear, and dynamite. But the lake remained stubborn. It kept its secrets close. And like the myth it fueled, it promised everything and delivered only echoes. By the late 16th century, El Dorado fever had crossed the Atlantic. No longer was it only a Spanish pursuit. Now the English, ambitious, rising, and eager to challenge Spain's dominance, set their sights on the Golden City. And no one was more enchanted by the legend than Sir Walter Raleigh, a poet, soldier, and favourite of Queen Elizabeth II. Raleigh was bold, intelligent, and full of theatrical charm. But he was also fiercely ambitious, desperate to carve a legacy that would rival the great conquistadors. El Dorado, he believed, was not just a myth, it was his destiny. In 1595, sailed to Ghana, the dense, unmapped region near the Orinoco River in present-day Venezuela. He had read Spanish reports, heard tales from captured natives, and convinced himself that the city of gold lay somewhere in the rain-drenched interior. His journey was grueling, thick jungles, choking heat, and uncooperative terrain. But he returned home with a spectacular story. He claimed to have found a civilization on the verge of discovery, a land rich with gold ruled by a mighty emperor just beyond reach. His published account, The Discovery of the Large, Rich and Beautiful Empire of Guiana, was filled with vague maps and suggestive detail. There was no proof, but Raleigh's words sparkled with enough imagination to captivate England. Queen Elizabeth was in 1617, after years of confinement, he was granted one last chance, an expedition to Guiana to finally prove his claim. This time, it all fell apart. His men attacked a Spanish outpost, violating the fragile peace between England and Spain. Worse, Regi's beloved son, Wat, was killed in the skirmish. Defeated, grieving, and empty-handed, Raleigh returned to England. King James was furious. Raleigh was executed in 1618, beheaded in public, his dreams undone by the very myth he once made shine. He had chased a city that may never have existed, and in doing so he became its most tragic explorer. As the centuries turned, El Dorado refused to die. With every failed expedition, the myth only grew more potent, like a mirage that shimmered brighter the more it was chased. The jungle, vast and uncharted, became both canvas and executioner. Countless men ventured into its emerald depths, convinced that gold awaited just beyond the next ridge, the next river, the next breathless day. They came from everywhere: Portuguese fortune seekers, German adventurers, Dutch traders, Jesuit missionaries. Each carried stories, weapons, and dreams. Few returned, fewer still returned sane. The Amazon rainforest, which spans millions of square kilometers, is one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. Thick canopies blocked out the sun. Rivers changed direction without warning. Poisonous insects and deadly snakes blended into the foliage. Starvation claimed some, disease claimed others. Those who managed to push deeper faced even greater threats. Indigenous tribes, fiercely protective of their lands, whose resistance was swift, coordinated, and often fatal. Time and again the same pattern emerged: a promising lead, a well-funded expedition, weeks of struggle and then silence. Many were never seen again. Still, belief persisted. The myth had evolved. El Dorado was no longer a single city. It became a floating dream. To some, it was hidden in the Andes. To others, deep in the jungle's belly. Some imagined it in caves, others in lakes. It changed with every explorer's hope. And that's what made it dangerous. The jungle didn't need traps, it didn't need armies, it only needed time. Men wandered deeper and deeper, guided by hope and misdirection, until exhaustion broke them. Some went mad, others turned on each other. The line between explorer and victim blurred until it was erased entirely. Even when nothing was found, the survivors still spoke of signs, glimpses of golden idols, distant lights, strange voices echoing at night. Their minds, half starved and half hallucinating, became compasses spinning wildly in all directions. El Dorado had become a psychological labyrinth, one that promised paradise but demanded everything in return. The jungle didn't guard a city of gold, it guarded a story. And in that story, hope itself became a trap. For centuries, the myth of El Dorado was dismissed as fantasy, an illusion spun from greed, misunderstanding, and European arrogance. But in recent decades, something remarkable has emerged. Evidence that maybe, just maybe, El Dorado wasn't entirely a lie. Not a city of golden walls. Not streets paved in treasure, but signs of vast advanced civilizations that once thrived in the very regions conquistadors called empty. Deep within the Amazon, archaeologists and scientists have uncovered remnants of lost cities, agricultural systems, and vast road networks now buried beneath layers of jungle. In Brazil, Bolivia, and Peru, satellite imagery and ground surveys have revealed the outlines of geometric mounds, mowed towns, and intricate irrigation canals. These weren't small tribal encampments, they were organized societies, some likely home to tens of thousands of people. And then there's the soil. In scattered parts of the Amazon, researchers found terra pater, dark earth, enriched with charcoal, bones, and compost. It's not natural, it was engineered, created by ancient Amazonians to make poor soil fertile. It suggests a long-term, sustainable civilization that understood its environment far better than once believed. Could it be that when early explorers spoke of great cities in the jungle, they were seeing the last flickers of a dying world, a civilization ravaged by European disease before it could be fully understood? Some believe so. Even Francisco de Orellana, whose Amazon journey was long considered exaggerated, is now being reassessed. His claims of bustling cities and powerful tribes were dismissed for centuries, but new findings suggest he may have been telling the truth, just a version of it Europe wasn't ready to believe. So perhaps El Dorado was never one golden city, but the reflection of many real ones, a patchwork of thriving cultures that dazzled the eyes of outsiders only to vanish under jungle. And the gold may have been symbolic, the grandeur exaggerated, but the roots of the story were always real. El Dorado may not have been a place on a map, but it may have been a memory. As the myth of El Dorado spread through Europe, it didn't just live in songs or whispered tales, it was etched into maps. From the 16th to the 18th centuries, map makers, cartographers working from stories rather than science, began to fill the blank spaces of South America with invention. The unknown was terrifying, but it was also a blank canvas, and nothing filled that canvas better than gold. Across old parchment maps, the word El Dorado appears in bold script, pinned to lakes, rivers, and mountains that never existed. Sometimes the city was shown as nestled near Lake Guatavita. Other times it floated deep in the Amazon or hidden behind the Orunino. Some maps included entire golden empires complete with drawn buildings, sun temples, and fantastical creatures guarding the way. These maps weren't drawn to deceive, not exactly. They were drawn to sell. Each one was a siren song to monarchs, merchants, and mercenaries. They sparked funding for expeditions. They justified claims over foreign lands. They offered explorers something just real enough to chase. The absence of proof was the point. The less certain the location, the more imagination it allowed. And so the myth grew, not just in stories, but in geography. Some of these maps found their way into royal courts. Others were published in books passed from hand to hand by those dreaming of wealth and wonder. They were copied, plagiarized, embellished, and every new version added more detail, more certainty, more allure. These false geographies had real consequences. Expeditions were launched based on them. Lives were lost pursuing the curves of rivers that didn't exist. Entire regions were colonized based on legends scribbled by men who had never stepped foot outside Europe. But the most fascinating part, some of these maps continued to circulate after El Dorado had been discredited. Why? Because humans don't let go of hope easily. A map is more than a tool, it's a promise. And these promises glittered. Even today, those antique maps are sought after collector's items, not because they're accurate, but because they captured a moment when belief was stronger than evidence. El Dorado never needed to be real. It just needed to be drawn. Centuries have passed. The jungle has swallowed up the bones, the rusted swords, and the silent footprints of those who chased El Dorado. And still the myth survives. It lives in books, films, and museum exhibits. In the animated stories we show our children, and the documentaries we stream late into the night. It's Indiana Jones and the road to El Dorado. It's a symbol now, more than a city, more than a man. It's an idea. Even into the 19th and 20th centuries, explorers still return to South America, armed now with compasses, rifles, and scientific curiosity. Alexander von Humboldt, one of the most respected scientists of his time, ventured through South America in the early 1800s. Though skeptical, even he was drawn to the stories. He searched not for gold, but for truth, and found the jungles still whispered of hidden civilizations. Later came Percy Fawcett, the British explorer whose obsession with a lost Amazonian city. He called it Zed mirrored the old dreams of El Dorado. In 1925, he vanished into the jungle with his son, never to return. Some say he died at the hands of a tribe. Others believe he found something and chose to stay hidden. And even in the 21st century, the search hasn't ended. Armed with satellite imagery, drones, and LAR technology, archaeologists are still uncovering evidence of ancient, complex Amazonian civilizations. No golden city has been found, but new ruins, earthworks, and settlement grids suggest that the heart of the jungle once beat with life far richer than ever imagined. And yet El Dorado still gleams, not on the ground, but in the mind, because we never really needed proof. We needed the pursuit, the idea that somewhere out there is more, that one last secret remains untold, that if we go far enough, try hard enough, risk enough, we'll find the thing that changes everything. El Dorado is no longer a physical place. It's a metaphor for ambition, for obsession, for the human hunger for what lies just beyond the horizon. We chase it in careers, in relationships, in dreams, And sometimes in jungles, it doesn't matter if it's real. What matters is that we keep walking toward it. In the end, El Dorado was never found. No gilded city, no palace walls shimmering in the sun, no thrones carved from emerald. The jungle never opened its hands. And yet the legacy of it was what the journey revealed about themselves, about civilization, and about the stories we cling to. They found rivers no map had ever shown. They encountered people with knowledge of the forest that rivaled any European academy. They recorded languages, flora, and customs never before seen by the Western world. Some of them, like Francisco de Orellana, unknowingly made history, not by discovering El Dorado, but by opening a path into the heart of the largest rainforest on Earth. Others lost everything, their wealth, their sanity, their lives, and yet they too are part of the legend. Their names echo through time, not for what they found, but for what they were willing to risk. El Dorado endures because it speaks to something buried deep inside us, the belief that there is always more to discover, more to become, more just beyond the horizon. We see it in every venture, every impossible dream. The entrepreneur chasing the perfect idea, the artist searching for the perfect work, the traveler seeking the untouched corner of the world. They are all, in their own way, following a golden city that may not exist, but still shapes everything they do. The myth is not a failure, it's a mirror. It reflects our ambition, our curiosity, and yes, our greed. It shows how far we'll go for something beautiful, something meaningful, something that whispers to us in the quiet, saying, just a little further. El Dorado is not a lost city, it's a question, and each generation answers it in their own way. So the next time you hear a story too good to be true, ask yourself, is it a lie or is it a dream worth chasing? Because sometimes the real El Dorado is the journey itself. The origins of the Olympic Games weren't about records or trophies, they were about reverence. It was the year 776 BCE, deep in the cradle of ancient Greece. Across the mountains and valleys, people began to gather, not to fight, not to trade, but to worship. They came to a sacred place known as Olympia, nestled in the lush landscape of the Peloponnesian Peninsula. There was no city here, only a religious sanctuary shaded by olive trees and protected by the watchful gaze of gods carved in marble. The purpose to honor Zeus, the king of the gods, through ritual, sacrifice, and the physical excellence of mortal men. The Olympic Games were born not in a stadium, but at an altar, an ancient mound of ash built from generations of burnt offerings. Before a single race was run, before a discus flew through the air, sacrifices were made, oxen were led to the altar, incense was burned, hymns were sung. The first Olympics were at their core an act of devotion. Only Greek men were allowed to compete, only free citizens. They came representing their polis, city-states like Athens, Corinth, Argos, and Sparta. Each athlete wasn't just racing for himself, he was racing for his homeland, carrying its pride on his back like a cloak. There were no stands, no announcers, no global audience, but the air buzzed with something sacred. Olympia became a crossroads where language, politics, and rivalry paused, if only for a few days. And Greeks remembered that they were one people under the gods. And so from all corners of the Hellenic world, they came barefoot and bronzed, some walking for weeks, just to be part of the moment. Competing wasn't just allowed, it was holy. It was a way of stepping closer to the divine, of testing the human form as the gods intended it to be, strong, focused, and unashamed. There was no gold, no silver, only honor, No empire had demanded this gathering, no king decreed it. The games rose from a deeper place, something woven into the soul of Greek identity. Here, in the shadow of temples, under the eyes of Zeus, the Olympic Games took their first breath, not as sport, but as sacred ritual. In a land often divided by rivalries and endless war, it was remarkable that every 4 years the Greeks found a reason to stop fighting. That reason was Zeus. Before each Olympic Games began, heralds were sent out from Elis, the region that governed Olympia, to announce the Echeria, the sacred truce. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a solemn, binding agreement. For 1 month, sometimes 3, all warfare across the Greek world was to cease. No armies could march, no soldiers could draw swords. Even hostile borders were temporarily opened, allowing athletes, priests, and spectators to travel freely. The truce didn't mean peace between city-states. It meant respect for something higher than politics, the gods. In theory, it allowed athletes from anywhere in the Greek world, whether allies or bitter enemies, to journey safely to Olympia. In practice, it was a miracle of diplomacy. City-states that had clashed on the battlefield one season could stand side by side on the track the next. Even Sparta, with all its martial pride and defiance, observed the truce for much of its early history. To violate the truce was to invite divine wrath. Divine wrath was Zeus. Before each, those who dared face sanctions not just from other city-states, but from the gods themselves. Zeus was not just a protector of the games, he was their witness. At Olympia, a massive bronze statue of Zeus stood with thunderbolt in hand, a silent reminder that the rules of the gods were not to be broken. But the truce wasn't only about safety, it was about unity. Greece was not a nation, it was a patchwork of fiercely independent police, often at war with each other. Yet through the sacred truce, they could gather together in a single place for a single purpose, bound by a shared reverence. It was more than just political necessity, it was symbolic. The truce taught that even in a world ruled by conflict, there could be moments of order, respect, and ritual. For a brief time, Greek identity rose above rivalry. And as the olive wreaths were prepared and athletes stepped into the arena, it was under the quiet power of peace. Not one enforced by soldiers, but one commanded by the gods. At Olympia, there were no uniforms, no tunics, no armor. The athletes of ancient Greece competed naked, fully, and deliberately. To the modern mind, it might seem shocking, but to the ancient Greeks, the unclothed body was not something to hide. It was something to celebrate. Strength, symmetry, and discipline weren't just physical traits. They were reflections of virtue, of the soul made visible. Competing nude wasn't just allowed, it was expected. It was part of the ritual. The Greek word gymnos means naked. From it came gymnasium, the training ground, and later the gymnasium. To train the body was to train the mind. Athletes covered themselves in olive oil, not for vanity, but to showcase the form and reduce chafing during movement. Dust was often sprinkled over the oil to prevent slipping and to accentuate muscle definition. In this sacred setting, the human form became art. And it wasn't just about appearance. Competing naked symbolized equality. In the arena, wealth and social class were stripped away, literally. What remained was effort, discipline, and raw physical skill. The body became the only uniform, and excellence became the only rank. But this exposure also had a moral edge. For the Greeks, shame was not in nudity, but in cowardice, cheating, or weakness. To step onto the track, into the wrestling pit, or before the javelin line without clothing, was a declaration. I have nothing to hide. It was a gesture of transparency, of boldness. The athlete placed himself before the gods and his people in complete honesty. Sculptures from this era reflect that reverence. Chiseled statues of runners, discus throwers, and wrestlers, often idealized, were not just decorations. They were symbols of the heroic spirit, frozen in marble for generations to study and admire. Even the gods themselves, Apollo, Heracles, were depicted in the same heroic nudity. Women, of course, were excluded not only from competing, but even from watching. Only unmarried girls were allowed as spectators, and even that was rare. The Olympic space was wholly male, sacred, exposed, and competitive. In this environment, nudity wasn't indecent, it was divine. The naked athlete stood as a living offering, a body trained, tested, and transformed, not for glory alone, but for the favor of Zeus. In the first Olympic Games, there were no second chances. Only one man could win. There were no silver medals, no podium, with 3 tiers. The Greeks believed that excellence was singular. Victory was absolute. And so in every event, only the first-place athlete was honored, crowned with a simple yet sacred reward, a wreath of wild olive leaves cut from a holy tree near the temple of Zeus. The olive wreath called a katinos held no monetary value. It wasn't gold, didn't sparkle, and couldn't be traded, but it meant something greater. It was a gift from the gods, a living symbol of immortal glory. To win an Olympia meant having your name recorded for all time. It meant returning to your polis as a hero. Your statue might be erected in the sanctuary. Poets might write verses in your name. Cities sometimes offered their champions lifetime privileges, free meals, theatre seats, or public office. But the games weren't about prizes, they were about arete, a Greek concept of virtue and excellence. To possess arete was to fulfill your purpose, to perform at the height of human potential. And for athletes, that meant winning, nothing less. The competitions were fierce. Victory was not just personal, it was political. Each athlete represented his city-state. A win at Olympia reflected not just his own strength, but the strength and honor of his people. The glory belonged to all. That made victory even more vital and defeat even more bitter. There was no room for excuses, no do-overs. The line between eternal fame and total obscurity could be measured in a breath, a stumble. They returned home quietly, often forgotten by history, but the victor, he stood apart, crowned in silence, his wreath catching the light. He became part of something sacred. The Greeks believed that such men were touched by the divine. They had not just outrun their rivals, they had pleased the gods. In a world without medals or sponsorships, this single, fragile crown of olive leaves meant everything, because for the Greeks, immortality didn't come from wealth, it came from being remembered. The very first Olympic Games, held in 776 BCE, featured only a single event, a sprint known as the stadium. It was a foot race roughly 192 meters long, the length of the stadium itself. There were no starting blocks, no shoes, no false start penalties, just bare feet on packed earth, a straight line marked between 2 posts and silence before the judge's signal. The runners leaned forward, dust rose, and then they ran. The first recorded Olympic champion in history was a cook named Koibos of Elise, a humble man whose name would echo for thousands of years simply because he ran the fastest once. His prize, not money, not power, just a wreath of olive leaves and a place in the eternal scroll of Olympic victors. Over time, the games grew. By the 7th century BCE, new events were added. the dolos, a double-length race, the deutschos, a long-distance run. Then came wrestling, discus, javelin, and the long jump, all parts of the brutal pentathlon, an event testing total physical ability. To win, you had to be not just fast, but strong, agile, and clever. One of the most awe-inspiring additions was the pancreon, a deadly blend of wrestling and boxing with almost no rules. Anything was allowed except biting and eye gouging. Men left the arena bloodied and broken. Some even died. But if you won, you were unstoppable, a living legend. And then came the chariot races, thundering hooves around the hippodromium, dust clouds rising, wheels shattering, horses and drivers tumbling. These races were dangerous, chaotic, and wildly popular. They weren't driven by the athletes themselves, but by hired charioteers. Yet the owner of the horses, not the driver, was awarded the crown. Status mattered. But in 776 BCE, it was just that first foot race. One event, one victor, one beginning. And yet from that single competition, a movement was born. One that celebrated the physical form as divine, that pushed the body beyond comfort and transformed sport into something more than a game. It became ritual, it became honor. And as the years passed and new events were added, the original race, the stadium, remained the heartbeat of the games, because everything Olympian began with a single sprint. The Olympic Games were not just competitions, they were ceremonies. Every race, every throw, every moment of exertion unfolded under the gaze of the gods. In Olympia, sport was sacred, and at its heart stood Zeus, ruler of Mount Olympus and the divine patron of the games. Before the contests began, a great sacrifice was held at the altar of Zeus. This wasn't symbolic, it was central. Dozens of oxmen were slaughtered in honor of the god. Their ashes piled high on an altar, made entirely from the remains of past sacrifices. This mound of sacred ash had grown over centuries, fed by the devotion of athletes and priests alike. To compete in Olympia, athletes had to swear a solemn oath in the temple of Zeus. With hands upon a piece of bow's flesh, they promised to train honestly, to compete fairly, and to bring no shame to the games. Cheating was not just dishonorable, it was sacrilege. Those who broke their oath could be fined, beaten, or permanently banned. Their names might be etched onto statues of Zeus' bronze effigies of Zeus, placed at the entrance of the stadium as a warning. Here are the ones who dishonored the gods. Presiding over the games were the Hellenodi, judges chosen from the region of Elis. They weren't mere referees, they were priestly figures, guardians of both the rules and the rituals. They trained for 10 months before the games, learning not only athletic standards but also religious protocols. They wore purple robes and carried staffs, symbols of their sacred authority. And then there was the Temple of Zeus itself, one of the largest and most majestic in the Greek world. Inside stood a statue over 40 feet tall, crafted by the sculptor Phidias, made of ivory and gold. Seated on a throne, holding a scepter and a figure of Nike, the god watched over the games with a calm, eternal gaze. It was so magnificent, it would later be named one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Every leap, every strike, every drop of sweat was a form of... The Olympic Games were an all-male affair, not only in competition, but also in attendance. Married women were strictly forbidden from watching the games. The penalty, according to legend, was death, specifically being thrown off Mount Tipan. It was a reflection of the deeply patriarchal structure of Greek society, where public life, especially in athletic and sacred spaces, was the domain of men. The games celebrated the ideal male form. Nudity was standard, And the competitions were not just athletic, they were philosophical. The male body, trained and disciplined, was seen as a reflection of cosmic order, a living sculpture of virtue. Women, especially married women, had no place in this visual and symbolic environment. Still, not all women were excluded from the Olympic story. Unmarried women were occasionally allowed to watch, and they had their own event, the Heran Games, held in honor of Hera, the wife of Zeus. These games featured foot races for young girls held in the same stadium, but with key differences. The races were shorter. The girls ran clothed, wearing short kittens that left one shoulder bare. Their hair was worn loose, unbound, and free. The victors received olive crowns and were allowed to dedicate statues to Hera. But while the Heron Games were meaningful, they were not the Olympics. The Olympic Games remained a sacred male ritual bound to Zeus and military values. Strength, endurance, and glory were cultivated for the battlefield as much as the arena. To be an Olympic victor was to be a hero of the polis, a role Greek women were simply not allowed to assume. There is one curious exception, the case of Ciniska of Sparta, a wealthy woman who bred horses. Because chariot races awarded the crown to the owner, not the driver, Ciniska technically became the first female Olympic champion. But even she never set foot in the stadium to witness her victory. The exclusion of women wasn't just custom, it was religious law, social code, and cultural identity wrapped into one. In Olympia, the games were many things, but they were not for women. In ancient Greece, a victory at Olympia was more than personal triumph. It was political capital. To win was to bring honor not just to oneself, but to one's polis, the home city-state. Every athlete stood as a living emblem of where he came from. A victory in the Olympic Games meant superiority in strength, discipline, and divine favor. And that superiority reflected on the society that raised him. When an Olympic victor returned home, he was welcomed as a hero. City gates were opened in his honor, crowds lined the streets, songs were sung, his name might be carved into stone or etched into local memory by poets. One of the most famous was Pindar, who composed elaborate victory odes rich in language and myth, commissioned by cities to immortalize their champions. But the celebration didn't end with applause. Victors were often rewarded with gifts, land, money, free meals for life, tax exemptions, or even statues in the public square. In some cities, they were given prime seats at the theatre or front rows at political gatherings. They might be elected to office, not because of their words, but because of their body and what it had proven in Olympia. Some wealthy elites used the Olympics to elevate their status. They funded training programs, sponsored athletes, or even bred horses for the chariot races where the owner, not the driver, claimed the prize. For these aristocrats, an Olympic win was like winning an election. It cemented their legacy, increased their influence, and shaped how history would remember them. Even rivalries between city-states played out through sport. When Athens and Sparta clashed politically or militarily, they also watched each other closely in the arena. Who had more victors? Who trained harder? Which policies did the gods seem to favor? Victory was a message. We are the stronger people. Our way of life is the better path. In this way, the Olympic Games became a stage for diplomacy, a battlefield of symbolic war where cities competed for glory without drawing blood. The olive wreath may have looked humble, but in the world of ancient Greece, it carried the weight of political power, cultural pride, and immortal memory. For over 1,000 years, the Olympic Games burned bright in ancient Greece. Every 4 years without fail, athletes, poets, priests, and spectators made the journey to Olympia not for profit, but for glory, devotion, and unity. But nothing in history is eternal. In 393 CE, the Christian emperor Theodosius I issued a decree that brought the ancient games to an end. To him, they were a pagan ritual incompatible with the growing dominance of Christianity in the Roman world. Temples, the voices faded. The names of champions were forgotten except by a few scribes who recorded their victories in dusty scrolls. And yet the idea never truly died. In the 19th century, as archaeologists uncovered the bones of Olympia, its columns, temples, and training grounds, interests stirred again. What if the games could return? Not just as a curiosity, but as a global symbol. In 1896, the vision became reality. The modern Olympic Games were born in Athens, reimagined by Baron Pierre Dubeta, who believed that sport could bring nations together in peace, just as it once brought Greeks together at Olympia. He borrowed many of the old traditions, the 4-year cycle, the flame, the procession of athletes. Even the ideal of a rhetor, excellence of body and spirit, was revived. Today the Olympic torch is lit in Olympia in the shadow of the ruined temple of Hia, using a parabolic mirror and the rays of the sun, just as it might have been in ancient days. From there, it travels across continents, a flame that connects past to present. And though the modern games are global, commercial, and competitive on a massive scale, their heart still beats with an ancient rhythm, a celebration of human potential, of peace, of striving for something higher than victory alone. From the sacred soil of Olympia to stadiums around the world, the Olympic spirit continues, not as a relic, but as a living tradition. The sacred fire was never truly extinguished, it was passed on. The tale of the Colossus doesn't begin with bronze or artistry. It begins with a siege and with a city that refused to fall. In 305 BCE, the island of Rhodes found itself under siege by one of the most feared military minds of the Hellenistic world, Demetrius Theus of Macedon, also known as the Besieger. He arrived with an army tens of thousands strong, backed by warships, catapults, and an infamous siege tower called the Helpless, a mobile fortress 9 stories high. Rhodes, by contrast, was small, a proud naval city, wealthy through trade and skilled in diplomacy, but dwarfed by Demetrius's might. His goal was to crush Rhodes for its alliance with Egypt, the rival power of the Ptolemies. It should have been a short campaign. It wasn't. For nearly a year, the Rhodians held the line. They used their terrain, their walls, and their wits. At night, they snuck out to burn siege equipment. They cut off supply routes. They adapted faster than Demetrius could adjust. Even when the massive Helpolis rolled toward the city, they found a way to disable it, drenching it with oil and setting it alight. Eventually, the siege collapsed. Demetrius withdrew, humiliated, leaving behind his war machines and shattered pride. The city was spared. Its people, though scarred, were unbroken. And now they wanted to make sure no one ever forgot. The Rhodians gathered the remains of the siege, abandoned towers, broken catapults, and thousands of pounds of bronze and iron. These would not go to waste. They would be melted, reforged, and reborn, not into weapons, but into a monument. To mark their improbable victory, they chose to honor their patron deity, Helios, god of the sun. They would build him a statue, not ordinary, not even grand, but colossal, something the world had never seen. They commissioned Charis of Lindos, a sculptor known for his precision and ambition. He promised not just a statue, but a symbol, something that would say in no uncertain terms, Rhodes stands tall, Rhodes stands free. And so from the ashes of war, the vision of the Colossus began, not as a wonder, but as an act of defiance. With victory still fresh and pride swelling in their hearts, the people of Rhodes turned their attention to a project unlike any the world had ever seen. They would build a statue not just to commemorate their resistance, but to send a message across the seas, a message cast in bronze and rooted in stone. They chose to honor Helios, the sun god, whom they believed had protected their city during the siege. In Rhodes, Helios wasn't a distant celestial being. He was a guardian, a presence woven into the identity of the island. His rays shone on every harbour stone, and now he would be given form. To bring that vision to life, they summoned Charis of Lindos, a native Rhodian and a master sculptor. Charis had trained under Leucippus, the famed sculptor of Alexander the Great. He understood proportion, symmetry, and ambition. The task before him was monumental. The Colossus would stand over 100 feet tall, nearly the height of a modern 10-story building. It would be made entirely of bronze with a supporting structure of iron and stone. The materials came from the very siege machines Demetrius had left behind. The statue was likely built from the ground up, with each section carefully cast, assembled, and reinforced as the structure rose. Workers toiled in the blazing sun, shaping metal, aligning joints, and creating what would become one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. We don't know exactly what it looked like. No ancient images survive, but it's believed Helios stood upright, perhaps with one hand shielding his eyes as he looked east, or with an arm raised in triumph, his face calm, his crown a radiant halo of sunbeams. It wasn't just art, it wasn't just religion, it was identity. Forged from the relics of war, the Colossus of Rhodes was more than a statue. It was a reminder to all who entered the harbour that this city stood unshaken and that its light would not be dimmed. When the Colossus was finally completed sometime around 280 BCE, it was not merely a statue, it was a revelation. Standing more than 30 meters tall, the Colossus of Rhodes was the tallest statue of the ancient world, constructed entirely of bronze plates over an internal skeleton of iron and stone. It dominated the skyline of Rhodes and astonished every visitor who sailed into the harbour, though later myths would claim it straddled the harbour entrance with ships passing between its legs. Historians and engineers agree this would have been structurally impossible. Instead, the statue most likely stood to the side of the harbour, perhaps atop a stone pedestal where it could be seen from afar. Its bronze body gleaming in the sun, its crown of radiating spikes echoing the sun god's divine rays. The engineering behind it was nothing short of extraordinary. Each bronze plate was carefully shaped and fitted, locked into a hidden framework that kept the giant stable. Weights were distributed evenly, joints were concealed. The statue may have been built using earthen ramps which were raised gradually as construction climbed upward, then removed once the final section was complete. The figure of Helios likely stood in a calm, upright pose, one hand resting by his side, the other raised perhaps in salute or holding a torch. His face was serene, youthful, and idealized, as was the Greek artistic tradition. His gaze would have been cast across the sea, watching over sailors and merchants as they entered the harbour of Rhodes. But the Colossus was more than just a guardian. He was a symbol to Rhodians. Helios embodied freedom, resilience, and divine favour. His towering form announced to the world that Rhodes had not only survived the siege, but emerged greater. The city had taken the weapons of war and turned them into a monument of peace. Visitors stood in awe. The statue wasn't just tall, it seemed eternal. The sunlight danced across his bronze surface, his shadow stretched across the harbour walls, and for a moment, standing beneath him, one could almost believe the gods walked among men. In Helios, Rhodes had built its pride and set it in bronze. For 12 shining years, the Colossus stood not just as a statue, but as a signal fire to the ancient world, announcing a new era for Rhodes. The city, long a crossroads of cultures and commerce, now found itself basking in international admiration. With the bronze form of Helios rising above its harbour, Rhodes became a beacon, both literal and symbolic, to visiting merchants, envoys, and poets. The Colossus declared that this island was more than a naval stronghold, it was a rising cultural force. The presence of the statue transformed public identity. The Rhodians saw themselves not merely as survivors of siege, but as chosen people, protected by the sun god, elevated by victory, destined for greatness. Helios wasn't just a god they worshipped in temples, he was now a presence casting his gaze from the skyline. The image of the Colossus soon appeared on Rhodian coins minted and traded across the Mediterranean. Helios, crowned with rays, became a mark of Rhodian pride and prosperity. Inscriptions celebrating the Colossus began to circulate. Travellers wrote of the way the sun seemed to reflect off his bronze skin at dawn, painting